Welcome to this episode of Wayward Writers. We hope you're conquering your path to publishing and that our podcast is helping you to do that. I have my co host, Nikki Jacobsmeyer, here with me today, while our other co host, Stephanie, is gallivanting across the Mediterranean. So, Nikki, would you tell us more about our intriguing guest today, please?
Absolutely. I would be thrilled to do that. So today we have Miffie Seidman for 20 years. She was a newborn ICU pharmacist, helping babies by day and a mom helping her own kids by night. She loved every moment. Once her kids were grown, she rekindled her creative side. Her novel, The Grim Reader, A Pharmacist's Guide to Putting Your Characters in Peril, was published by Indiana University Press in January 2024 and brings together her love for helping others, her continued work as a pharmacist, an extensive knowledge of drugs, and her world of writing. Now that The Grim Reader is published, when Miffy isn't training for her next triathlon, she's developing a fantasy, mixing demons, dragons, and betrayal with a dash of hope. On the weekends, she enjoys volunteering, baking her family's traditional Scottish shortbread, and spoiling her dog. We're so glad to
Mhm.
have you with us today, Miffy.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So, what motivated you to write The Grim Reader, and how did you identify the need for such a resource in this whole creative writing community?
Yeah, that was an interesting evolution. So I was at it was several things came together all at once. I was looking for a new writing project, which I honestly really didn't have the time for because I was still working in the ICU, but I felt this need. So I wanted that outlet. And then I had also started getting some consults, emails, and what have you from writers who knew that I was a pharmacist. And they were asking specific questions about, oh, hey, I want to write a scene like this. Will this drug work? Or which drug would you recommend? And so I was dabbling in that crossover field, as it were. And then my family started to notice that I was having real problems when I was reading stories or going to movies where the drug scenes were really wrong. And so they urged me to write something like that, Mom. Tell them how to do it better. And
Mhm.
so that was kind of the genesis, that clicking in my head. It was quite a bit of a road to get to the final product, but that's how it started. And I realized, there really are a lot of places where this would be very useful.
Absolutely.
So, you mentioned that there are these myths. What are some of the biggest myths that have been perpetuated in books and movies concerning drugs and drug related deaths and things like that?
Yeah, there are unfortunately quite a few. The probably the biggest ones I put in the categories of instant sedation or instant death, which a lot of writers seem to gravitate towards, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if this person just died right away? And drugs don't work that way. And I'm kind of glad they don't for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest ones everybody will probably recognize from spy thrillers and what have you is the chloroform rag over the mouth,
Yes.
and the character passes out right away. There might be like one or two little struggles, and then they stay asleep for two scenes.
Mm.
And that's just so not real. And the only way to get them to stay asleep for those 2 to 3 scenes would be leave that chloroform rag over their mouth, and they would be actually dead by the second scene. So they don't work that way. And I feel like um, even though as writers we like to have these shock and awe moments, it also does our readers a great disservice. Instead of that 3 line instant sedation or instant death, you can have your reader know that the character has just gotten whatever the drug is, and then get your reader to squirm a bit and worry a bit and watch that character go through some of the onset of the symptoms and kind of start to stumble or
Right.
have trouble, and the character acknowledges, oh no, I think I've gotten something, and then, oh, turn the page, you have to
Hmm.
read on. And I feel that's the adventure that we should be giving the readers instead of just, oh, drop dead.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
those I think are the biggest ones that have really, there were a few others that caused my family to shush me in a movie theater not too long ago. But those are probably the biggest.
Yeah, I mean, it builds that suspense, right? I mean, and
Yes,
whether
yes.
we want suspense regardless of what genre
Hmm.
or who or audience we're writing for. So that's so interesting because I think a lot of times people forget when they're writing fiction that there's still research needed and there's still that authenticity element, and we've discussed this before. People will call you out because they know, and the worst thing is your reader to be removed from the story because you're like, no,
Yes,
that's not how it really goes, and then it almost makes you feel like the author just kind of cheated in the actual real scenario. So
exactly.
so I'm thinking that knowing cutting edge treatments or drug technologies could help science fiction and fantasy writers incorporate like futuristic or innovative elements in a believable way. So, what are the latest advancements in pharmacology that could impact your story, and how would one keep up with them?
That is a loaded question.
So
We are in a
sorry.
great age. It's fine. It's very exciting. We're in this great age right now where between pharmacology and pharmaceutics, people are studying these better ways to get drugs into people. There are nanotechnologies out there looking at how to get drugs directly into one cell or one cancer cell in your body.
Wow.
It just blows my mind. There are people looking at things like the advances in what are called jet injectors. So if you go way back to the Star Trek days, they had the injectors that would go psh, right through your skin, and you had an injection, no needle. I'm like, oh, this would be so great. And to be fair, we have had those for decades. They just haven't worked well enough, and they've had some repercussions with them that have kept them from mainstream use. And so there's one out there I think that's been approved for insulin use right now. It's rather pricey, but they're working on how to improve that technology. I was reading in the last couple of days that there's even a pill that they're working on for people like me who don't like needles. There's a pill that they're working on that, and they didn't explain the entire mechanism, but that once you take the pill and it goes down into your intestines where there are no nerve endings, it sends an injection out there. And so you get your drug somewhere. It absorbs very well from there, but you don't have to feel it. And I'm thinking, oh,
Oh,
so there are
wow.
all these different avenues of what they're looking at that sound very sci-fi, far in the future, but they're right now. And a lot of that driven by things like cancer research and Alzheimer's research and implantable drugs, things of that nature. The second half of that question is really hard. Even for me as a pharmacist, even before I retired, keeping up with all the new drugs, all the methodologies is incredibly difficult. And it is a full-time job. Most clinical pharmacists come home at night and they're not done with their job. They're picking up the journals and they're starting to read and you're starting to understand. So when you go to work, you're on the cutting edge. But to ask people who don't live, eat, and breathe that to do that is very difficult. What I do recommend people to do is cruise around on the internet and look. You can do searches for newest methods to get drugs into bodies or pharmaceutical advancements and read a lot of little nerdy things. Unfortunately, most of those things will be the drug companies putting out their bias piece. But what you can also do is come up with an idea and say, hey, I think I'd love to get a drug into somebody this way. And then start asking professionals, say, hey, I've got this idea.
Mhm.
Is there anything like that in use in pharmacy or in pharmaceutics right now? Do you know if it's on the horizon? And then those people can funnel you towards the information you need, like, no, that's never going to work because, or, oh my gosh, yes, they are doing that. Here's some information you can read and delve into it a bit.
So interesting.
Yeah,
It
it's
is
it's a
fascinating.
crazy field out there, right? It's amazing what's coming our way.
Well, and like you just mentioned, not only researching, but asking people whether you know them or not. You know, you're at your pharmacist and, hey, pardon me, do you have a minute? But you might find something you that you didn't even know you were looking for. Like, I want
Yes.
this to happen. And then a whole new world or new plot twist or anything
Hmm.
could just completely open up just by asking the question. Once again, why being in front of people and with people is the synergy and this magic that sometimes we don't get in a different setting. So that's a
Yes,
wonderful
very,
idea.
very true.
I've been thinking, what if, I guess part of me just says, why not just use your imagination? If you're writing sci fi and fantasy, why not just use your imagination for something, and how believable does it really need to be? We want the reader to continue to suspend disbelief. In your opinion, how do you balance that need for pharmacological accuracy with the creative liberties that authors often take when crafting narratives?
That's a really good question, actually, because I think there is a fine line between the two. And I usually go back to the you need to know the rules before you break them and break them well. So it's
Yeah.
really contingent upon us as writers. If we're going to write about a drug or how it's being given, learn something about it. I mean, we spend so much time learning what Alaska looks like if our character is set in Alaska. I see this really as not that much different. Find out about it and then play with it. So you know that drug X is going to work this way. What of that can you take and throw into your creative license to walk it forward? Which parts of that are going to make this really good page turner, edge of chair kind of moment for my readers? And so you're still putting that creative piece in and then looking forward to, oh, just making sure that the drug you're using, if you're saying, oh, they're going to use it through this kind of injector right through the skin, that it would even be possible to absorb that way.
Mm.
For many readers, it may not make a difference, but you have millions, I mean, literally millions, just in the US alone, of pharmacists, doctors, nurses, paramedics, EMTs that are also your reader base. And what you don't want is to have them all go, ooh, or put up bad reviews like, don't go watch this movie
Mhm.
because, and we do talk about that off, saying like, oh, hey, did you read this new book? Yeah, but did you read? And we're all like, oh, yeah, you already know before you get there. Like,
Mm.
if you're okay if you pass that chapter. But I don't feel we owe that to our readers. I think we can use the facts and the truth and then throw them into a futuristic setting, but we're still sticking to how that drug might affect our character and at least having that ownership. Does that make sense? Still,
Yeah,
still adding
definitely.
creativity in though.
Right. Right. You said that there is a fine line, though, and I agree with that. So when we're writing about drugs and medical scenarios, do you think that there are ethical considerations that authors should keep in mind to avoid like
Mm.
glamorizing drug use or misrepresenting drug use?
Very, very much so. I've had some cases where authors have written me and said, hey, I need to know exactly how many pills my character should take to have X happen, or what is the actual dose? And that's a territory, that's kind of what I would call beyond the scope of where we should be writing. What we want to write about is the drug, the scene, the effect, what we need our readers and the characters to go through. We're not writing an instructional on medication treatment and how to injure somebody. And I think
Mhm.
that's where some of that line comes into play. We also don't want to glamorize, and there's been plenty of that already. You think of glamorous scenes. I think right now the big things out there are, this is fun, ecstasy cheese parties. So ecstasy is kind of big on the scene. So it's been glamorized as this high-end social party thing to hide into the brie on brie platters and
Oh,
things
geez.
like cocaine at high-end parties. But I feel that we have a right, or should, as writers, also temper that with showing some of the negative outcomes that come from that. I don't think we ever see characters that are just riding high and everything's great and we just keep doing cocaine. Something eventually happens, and that's that moral and ethical piece that's coming back.
Mhm.
Because just to glamorize or show how to hurt somebody is not our point, and definitely crossing a line.
Yeah.
That's such a good point.
Hmm.
Sorry, I'm kind of just
It's
thinking
very
about that
sobering, isn't
because,
it?
yeah,
Yeah, it's
I
very
mean,
sobering.
just we're all thinking about our own works in progress, right? As we're listening to this,
Hmm.
and that is huge. You don't never know who the reader is going to be. We don't choose that, and we have a responsibility to. any age reader of what fiction or non, what we're expressing and how we're doing it. So that's a good point.
Right.
Well, just a quick aside here. It makes me think of contracts. There are clauses in publishing contracts that say what happens with lawyers if you get sued, if somebody does something following the instructions in your manuscript. So I think that's definitely a cautionary thing that perhaps, like Miffy said, showing the vague things, but not how many pills and how you
Mm-hmm.
exactly do that kind of thing. Might be best to stay away from that.
Yeah, and I don't think that even that one of the writers that I was talking to, I said, think about it. What is that adding
Sure.
to your scene that you really
Right.
have to have? If you cut that out, do you still have enough drama and stress elsewhere? And when they looked at it that way, they thought, oh, I've been so focused on having to get the minutia and everything
Mm-hmm.
exactly right.
And being
And then
accurate
taking that,
and yeah,
yes,
but
yes.
maybe not to
Yeah.
the milligram and number. And I
No, I
mean,
don't think
but I
so.
mean,
No,
I could see that. I could totally be like, so how many is too many? Like, I want to get it right, but there's that other
right.
side of
Yeah.
it where it's like it's a brushstroke, right? So that kind
Yes,
of
very much.
brings me to my next question. What are ways that we can like use drugs in a broader way that can be used in our scenes that aren't going to necessarily have a negative effect of giving an instruction manual?
Oh, thank you. Yes, there are, because I think every time somebody sees my book, they think, oh, this is great. It's going to be an overdose scene or a death scene. And I think, oh, but you're missing so much.
Yes.
And the other pieces to that are we've got really two big other facets that it can be used for. Most everybody I know uses some sort of a substance or drug, period. It's part, whether you call it that or not, they have either any kind of caffeine going on, the lines out at some coffee shop. They may be smoking tobacco or using marijuana. They may use melatonin at night to sleep. All of that is a little piece of your character's persona, something that makes them more human and relatable to your readers.
Mm-hmm.
We all know the mom who drives through the 5 o'clock coffee in the morning to go take their kid to the soccer game. That's part of her, without which she might be a little bit more flat. So there are those pieces, and I've had writers write me and say, look, I want my character to drink and have some alcohol or go out and drink, but I don't know what that feels like. I've never done it. So
Mm.
can I incorporate that because it makes their character more human? So there's that side of it. And then there's the other side of painting a background or developing. We all want to have our character to have a little bit more depth and have some sort of a scar or wound that they're carrying that colors their worldview and helps them direct their plot. And there's so many ways you can do that. Maybe you have a character who is a recovered meth addict. And the things that he experienced, and there's such a wide range of what he could have
Mm-hmm.
experienced as a meth addict, now that he has recovered, this paints how he works through the plot and what he deals with and why he works with the youth home and tries to help other youth from going down the same pathway he went to. Or maybe there are some darker ones. There are some fentanyl pain patches out there that are used for chronic cancer. And unfortunately, when they're used and you have to put a new one on, the one you throw away really does have drug left in it. And it's pretty well known out there. And so you can have very negative scenes. And these have actually happened where somebody's grandchild will come visit and they will take those Band-Aid looking things out of the garbage and use them as stickers.
Mm.
And now you have a fatality. And now that grandparent in your story has a very dark past that he's dealing with. And how does that drive his character forward? And we're not even talking about showing that scene or having a dramatic overdose scene, but it's something that from a drug that affected him in the past. And there's so many
Mm-hmm.
like we've got today, there's a little trend out there in psychedelic parenting where some parents are using magic mushrooms to help the stress of parenting throughout the day. And so, what an interesting scenario that could make for a
Mm-hmm.
parent that's a character, but you're not really even showing them using it.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's where I would go with those concepts beyond the real obvious.
Sure. And I imagine just like a lot of resources using your book backwards, like go to get the information and be like, ooh, this
Hmm.
is unique or something you don't read or see all the time, and then infusing that into your characters and your scene. So how
Yeah.
important do you think it is for authors to have personal experience with the medical scenarios that they're writing about versus relying, solely on the research?
That's a very important point because one of the premises that I go into the book with is how are you going to write these scenes if you've never experienced these drugs or experienced
Mhm.
these circumstances? And I think that's really important. I don't think it's important for writers to have ever had either an addiction or have had drunk any alcohol or to have been treated with a narcotic to be able to write about it. What they do have to do is know what they know and know what they don't. And so researching the how do I get the drug in? How's my character going to get it and use it? What's he going to feel like? How can I paint that as a writer? And then go get it checked by somebody in that field. Like have a pharmacist or a medical professional beta reader. Just read this through. Does this sound smooth? Do the words sound right? Is this the way that they would give it? And smooth it out. And you can do that without ever having to have those experiences. Same thing with anything from overdoses on down that psychedelic drugs. You can apply all those principles.
You mentioned drugs that might have an adverse and negative effect. And then it makes me think about
Hmm.
medication for mental health. And like, I was feeling this way. And then when I saw a doctor and got prescribed this, then I felt this way. And the
Hmm.
positive of the healing mechanism of drugs and
Yes.
the repair. Like you said, it's not just the negative, it's also making people whole
Yes.
again and well. And that's also just as much of their depth as the harder, scarier effects of them.
Oh, very, very much so. And I think that's also part of the difficulty out there. If you only paint the negative sides,
Sure.
you get people that now are afraid to take pain medication when they really need it, or have tried to turn down things like fentanyl infusions during surgery when the outcome without that would be horrific. And it really is a good medication when used the
Sure.
right way. It's the street drugs we're worried about,
But that word, right?
And
You
so,
hear it and you're like,
yes,
oh,
yes.
whoa, whoa, like,
But so it's not all just the negative. There are also some great outcomes that come
Mhm.
out of that these days.
So I would like to turn to your book a little bit because obviously in our little podcast here we are only going to scratch the surface. So in your book there are some writing prompts.
Mhm.
Can you share how these writing prompts can help writers to develop their skills in crafting realistic drug related scenes?
Oh, sure. The way I went about it, and like I said, it was an evolution from when we first had the little concept of writing this kind of a book. The way we were taught in pharmacy that works really well when you're educating, and I did a lot of education in my career, is you teach some facts and then you have the person repeat back what they heard. Show me what you think you should do. And you try to word it in a way that's not like, did you listen to me? Try to get them to show you that they really had understanding. And that also reinforces the learning. And I thought, what a great way to teach writers how to move into a field of something that they really haven't experienced. And so each one of the chapters tries to build. And so we have a little bit of information at the beginning, and then a little bit of a sample scenario, and then the section called Now You Try It, giving them, the reader or the writer, both, a writing prompt. Apply to your character or a scene the bits and pieces you've just learned. Pick and piece. So it makes them also go back to that information and say, what do I want out of the history piece, or what do I want about how my character might take this? So I'm going to put that in some scene. And then you go and teach them a little bit more. How is your character going to act and feel while they're on this drug? Now go back and put that into your scene, or see if it fits in the scene, or advance your scene on a little bit more. And then at the end, it's how long is it going to last in your character? And so I finally sum that up in the end with, okay, let's go back and give them a sample scenario and have them try to finish up or start a new scene. Like, let's add it all in together. What does that look like? And it's not perfect, obviously, that first time, but it's done several things. It's done the reinforcement learning, and it drops down that fear barrier of, oh, I can't. And now it's like, oh, I can. I might just need to work on it a little bit more. I might need to turn back to the first page in the
Mhm.
chapter. And yeah. And so that's the way I constructed each one of those chapters.
That's awesome. It's a resource, but also like a workbook that can help
Yes.
develop. That's wonderful. So, are
Mhm.
there any topics or areas of pharmacology that you wish to explore or expand on a future edition of the Grim Reader? I'm
I
sure.
really just,
But
I
bring on
really
the
just
volume,
skimmed the
Miffy. We
surface.
want them. We want them.
I really skimmed only the beginnings of drugs. There are so many, and picking and choosing how to go was very, very challenging and difficult. And the headlines as we're going forward in time are kind of writing new chapters as we go along. Part of that, I would love to delve into herbal
Mm,
medicines more. It is such
Mhm.
a field. Supplements and herbals not only are a huge field out there, but they also offer a lot of potential plot twists and
Mhm.
problems for our characters, and as well as good things. So there's that piece. And then there are new changes in what drugs are being abused or misused or becoming hip with the youth.
mm,
You start squashing this drug over here, and all of a sudden they find a way. There's this drug over here. So we have things like pregabalin right now, and that's showing up in lots of different drug misadventures. We've got spice showing up in marijuana and creating some very serious outcomes. And so it would be nice to continue that on and find the other avenues. And then there's some drugs that I really didn't have the time to touch that were not quite as much of a here and now kind of highlight, or things that I thought readers would really recognize from the past, and delve into those.
yeah.
It'd be really cool to have drug use throughout history too, because that's something where you read the Count of Monte Cristo and
Oh,
they're
yeah.
obviously doing drugs and things like that. But I just think it would be fascinating to see what drugs were used throughout history. And I also think it's really cool with the herbal medicines. Like if you were a fantasy writer and you were writing about witchcraft or something like that, that could have a lot to do with herbal medicines and things like that too.
Absolutely.
Sure, very much.
That's neat.
So, does your book or would your future next book deal with combinations? Like you treat
Yeah.
someone, and you're like, oh, they're sick, they need this, but you have no idea what they're already taking. And so, does your book touch on that at all?
It really doesn't. That's such a
Big.
bigger topic to hit. It is very big. And that's where, in fact, some of my thoughts about going to herbal
Hmm.
remedies kind of bridged into that, because there are so many places where if you're using herbal remedy and you're using a medication, you could have some very serious outcomes. And so that was part of my thought. I have the one chapter called Leafy Leftovers that touches on some herbal remedies because of how they have been used in mainstream medicine. But
Hmm.
touching on all the drug combinations and interactions, there are one or two I talk about where if you're taking this and you take this other drug, this really bad reaction like serotonin syndrome could happen.
Yes.
But it is a very huge topic. And so I have not broached on that yet. It would certainly make several good chapters.
We just have all these volume ideas, Miffy. Go, go,
You
start. We
do.
we
I'm taking notes.
we
This is
want
great.
more. We want more.
Thank you.
What advice would you give to aspiring authors who want to write compelling and accurate medical or drug related scenes in their work?
Yeah, so the approach that I take is really to make sure that they know a few crucial pieces before they sit down to write. And I addressed that in some of the earlier chapters. And what they really need to do is make sure they know, if they're wanting to write a drug scene, make sure they pick one that was even had even been invented or discovered in the historical
Hmm.
time period that they're writing in, because that's a really bad miss, and an easy one to correct early on. Make sure that it can be given or was given the way they depict it. So if they're in the 1600s and they're giving injections, not going to work. So just make sure that you've got those facts correct going forward, and then find out about it. How does it work? How is it going to make your character feel? And then write that going forward and make sure you've got some of those critical pieces. One of the things that I offer are a couple of places to mix and match drugs and symptoms, so you can just
Mm.
make sure that, hey, I want drug X. Does it do these things? And you can go look. I have a section called the toxidromes, which are drug symptom combinations emergency room doctors use to try to guess what the unconscious patient took that's wheeled into the ER.
Interesting.
But they can use that to piece together pieces for their scene and move it forward. But as long as they know some of those crucial pieces, they can use their creative knowledge to drive that forward and then just make sure they have a beta reader who knows that subject matter just to read through it to make sure it sounds right.
Good advice. Thank you.
So we're circling back here to the beginning, but how do you think these accurate portrayals of drug use and pharmacology in literature can impact the public perception and understanding of these issues? I have watched things over the years and had a completely different view of drugs than what's actually true.
So that is a very good point, and I think there are a couple of very hallmark things happening over the last couple of years that are perfect examples of that. I touched on a little bit of it before, but there have been misrepresentations of how fentanyl works and how it affects people to the point where misinformation got out and some writers ran with it and they
Mm.
didn't ever verify the information. And people who wrote or did some YouTube instructionals for people ran with it. And so what you ended up having was a perpetuation that if you touch fentanyl, like if you walk and touch a fentanyl tablet or are in the same room and smell near it, that you're going to pass out and need the antidote naloxone or Narcan. And that's just not true.
Oh dear.
By itself, that's dangerous because it paints this really good pain medication as this lethal, fearful thing to people who might be offered that when they go into the hospital for certain kinds of treatment. On the other hand, the unintended consequences were that emergency medical technicians, so paramedics, your EMTs, and even some physicians were afraid to respond to emergency scenarios where there were potentially and policemen out where there were potentially drugs on the scene because they were afraid they were going to die if they rendered aid to that victim.
Mm.
And that is so dangerous. And now, so that's a whole education process that was that I told two people and they told two people, and this must be how the drug works. And I think we do a disservice to obviously that kind of scenario where you could actually have somebody die because of that misinformation. But we also have the opportunity to educate. And I know when I'm sitting down and writing my fantasy, and I'm not trying to educate mom and dad on drugs that their teenager might be using. But if I miseducate and don't teach them correctly, they may not be aware or may not look for the right things that could have helped them in a particular scenario, or I might miseducate them about how something works. And I think that's very wrong as well. So there's a lot of miseducation out there, and getting those kinds of things right. I think those are the headliner pieces that I see. I tell a lot of writers that say, "Oh, I'm grabbing things from the headlines." I'm like, "That's awesome. That's an idea, but go research to make sure that what that journalist or whoever wrote that chapter in the book did it correctly. Don't just mimic from them because they could very well be wrong. And now you're perpetuating wrong drug mechanisms and how they could help or hurt people. So that's been very large lately.
It seems pretty crucial for authors to consult with pharmacists and medical professionals when they're writing these scenes.
I think so. And it's not that they can't do their own thing and do the creative piece and take a look at the information I provide. It's like right there, and follow those same steps if the drug that they're looking at isn't quite within the scope of what I've written yet. But then go get it checked. And you've got different levels of medical providers. So you can check with an EMT or
Mhm.
paramedic and see if it's something that's that kind of a scene that you're writing. You check with them and see, hey, is this how you really have given
Yeah.
it? If you're looking for a pharmacist and it's a hospital setting, your retail pharmacist is specialized in a different area, they're not going to know the answer. So go contact the hospital pharmacist and say, hey, and they're probably going to love to sit down with you over coffee and tell you about. We love talking about our drugs. So, but just and just get it double checked. Say, hey, would you mind just read a
Sure.
scene for me? Could you help me out? Yeah.
Well, and that's
Um,
another nice part about being part of a writing community is yes, we're
yeah.
writers, but we have other backgrounds and other specialties. And it's a
Yes.
great place to be like, hey, is anyone this profession or something like that? There's people I've known for years, and it's like,
Yes.
oh, wait a minute, you did what in your other life? You know what I mean? But it's a wealth of information
Yeah.
that we can all use and
It
scratch each
is.
other's back. So
Yeah, it definitely is.
so, Miffy, you mentioned earlier about historical accuracy. And can you give us an example of a drug or treatment that has changed over time and how this could affect the story depending on what era it's written in?
Yes, that's great. There is one section in my book I talk about sedatives, and that's a great example. They have changed so much over time. So those older stories from way back when, your Agatha Christie kind of times, you're talking about chloral hydrate and
Yes.
maybe, yes, chloral hydrate, which I used not that long ago in the newborn ICU, surprisingly. But yes, it kind of straggled on there. And we also had bromides, the powder packs for sleeping and the bromides. That, because of side effects and because of problems with those and new drugs that came on the market, that gave way to things like your barbiturates. And so you've got your phenobarbs. I think Agatha Christie in one of hers talks about barbital as one of the sleeping potions somebody's taking. And so then that gave way to benzodiazepines, which were the big new sleeping pills and the sedatives and anti-anxiety pills. They did everything for us. And then because those showed up to be somewhat pretty addictive, they've been trying to move on to other medications. So if you're writing about 10 years ago, you're picking a different drug than 50 years ago, very much decidedly. And the same thing is true with opiates because of
Mm,
the big opiate crisis. The way they're used, the way they're prescribed, and how much is given to each patient is very different. 15 years ago, I could have an entire bottle of Vicodin in my bathroom shelf that I didn't take from my wisdom teeth coming out. So I've got 30 pills sitting in there for a scene. Today's setting, that's not quite honest. So if you're taking a contemporary scene, unless you're going to grandma's cabinet, she hasn't thrown things away for a really long time, which is a thing.
yes.
They people do hoard their medication, but you're not likely to find that same scenario these days. And so because they've restricted how much they
Hmm.
prescribe in a single setting, and so you have to be aware of those kinds of pieces and how they change through history.
That's so fascinating. And what is the one I always read about? I'm going to pronounce it probably incorrectly. Laudrum or they it's like a sleeping
Oh, yes, laudanum.
lot of thank you. The vowels
Laudanum,
get me every
yes.
time.
That's okay. That one can be tough. And so that's an opium
Okay.
derivative. Yes.
That
And
I
so
felt like
that
was
one
given out
actually
all the time. Like, it's time for bed, bedtime
it
story, and get your
it was. And surprisingly, even when I was a child, there was a drug called paregoric that was still being used because it has opium in it. It had opium and a bunch of other things. I called it the kitchen sink drug because it had anise and it had some other things that actually could create seizures. But it had the opium in there and it also had alcohol. And so it would calm down the gut and it would help put people to sleep. It also smelled absolutely horrible. But that and tincture of opium, which is really today's modern version of laudanum, is still used
Mm,
in very specific settings. And even, probably 15 years ago, 10 years ago in the newborn ICU, we were still using tincture of opium and paregoric to treat newborns that were in withdrawal from a mom that had been on narcotics. And so that has changed. Now we just give them straight up morphine, so,
mm.
which is really what is in that opium that we were trying to use. And there are new methods to not have to give drugs to some of the withdrawal babies, but that has greatly changed over the decades. But tincture of opium is still widely used.
That's so interesting. And when you said the smell, like that's another thing.
Oh,
Some of these drugs, they have a smell or it tastes
yes.
a certain way. And those
Hmm.
are such great senses that could just totally enrich that scene. So
Yes,
fun.
very
Well, and
much.
I was thinking when she talked about
Yes.
grandma's medicine cabinet, it made me think I bet there's a bunch of different drugs that expire or change their makeup and would change over time when you take it, what actually
Hmm.
happens. Like maybe some become inert, but others change into something even more dangerous.
Yeah, and so there's that entire degradation thing that can go on, and things like
Right.
aspirin that start smelling like vinegar because it's not working very well anymore. But you can have some drugs that are outdated. Tetracycline is one of them, which was used quite a bit and still is. It's a good antibiotic,
Hmm.
but when it gets old, it can actually cause kidney damage that's very severe. And that's such a huge realm of, and some of them, they just over time, there's less and less of the active drug in there, so you're really not getting the treatment that you need. So if you're using an old drug, you
Hmm.
may not be treating your blood pressure well or what have you.
So interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, a
It
whole
is
nother
interesting. There's a whole nother
can of
there's a whole
worms.
nother
Yeah,
volume.
there's another book, another volume.
Thank
We'll just
you.
keep coming up with them. Well, going back to the Grim Reader, can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the book?
Oh, sure. So the way I constructed it in the very beginning, it's don't be afraid to write this stuff. This stuff is, you can do this, just follow some basic tips. And so I go into some of the basic tips these are the main things you really should know. And then the question is, what do you do? Do you already have a drug in mind? Or do you have a symptom in mind? And then I guide them into the book. Here's where you go then to try to find out more about that. And then the book itself is broken down into chapters that focus on either one kind of drug or one, like opiates is one very large chapter, so many different kinds. But each one goes through the same information setup. A brief amount of the social use and the history of the drug to give writers a start in on looking at the history of that drug, and then they can follow that out more as much as they need, but it gives them a sensitivity for the things they probably need to know. And then I go into how is this drug going to be given to your character? How is it used? How is it going to make them feel? How long is it going to last?
Mm.
And then within those sections are the sample scenarios. Here's an example of how to use this information. Now you go try it yourself. Either grab one of your own characters or build a scene from scratch. And so each one of the chapters is built that way. And then at the very end of the book, I have an index that I worked on to have it be really elaborate.
This was so fascinating, and thank you,
It was very
yes, for
enlightening.
sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and I can't wait to get my hands on a copy. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Wayward Riders. Conquer your path.